This is my very first attempt at painting the ocean, and I'm going to walk you through my thought process. Starting with a blank canvas and no guidelines, which is very terrifying for me, I wet my whole piece of paper. If you guys are wondering, all the supplies I am using will be listed below, but the first thing I had to do was set the tone I was looking for. So using the wet on wet technique, I mapped out where the horizon line was and created a base for how the waves were going to react. Then I added in the first layer of the sky. I wanted it to be a very misty, dark mood, so I used a gradient technique where the closer it got to the horizon, the darker the color got. And here I'm adding in some more depth to the waves by adding in a second layer of color. I honestly just repeat this step a couple of times until I like how it looks. I accidentally added too much water, and since the paper is wet, I just dab my brush in clean water and brush over where I want to bring back the highlights. So now I'm kind of creating that misty effect where the skyline meets the water, and I'm bringing it up on the edges to kind of give it this flow down to the water. Now on a completely dry piece of paper, I begin adding the waves one by one. I kept this real time so you could see how loose I was being with my strokes. And here I really studied my reference and really paid attention to the overall structure of the waves. I noticed the waves were shaped like mountains, and I got smaller as the waves were further from the camera, or my point of view that I'm using here in the piece. And after I finished the general idea of the waves, I wanted it to be misty, so I dabbed my paper towel on the still wet paper to lighten and create a mist effect that I could follow as my layers go on. On top of that, I created a layer of mist using a light wash of the grayish blue sky color to blend everything together. I chose to paint on a wet and cloudy day because it gave me the ability to look outside and use it as inspiration for my piece. So after that, I laid down another wash of color to darken the mood, and once that layer was completely dried, this is where I create my wave foundation. I create my baby mountains just keeping in mind to stay loose with my wrist and preserve my highlights. Here I am actually using a number 4 round brush to get the sharp and detailed strokes. It's also really important that the paper is completely dry so you don't get any feathering like I did the first time I started the waves. I also noticed the waves get lighter as they fade into the body of water, so I made sure to keep spaces between the waves. But from here, I just keep adding layers to the waves to make them darker the closer they are to the foreground, and keeping them lighter the further they are into the background. I'm also using a different mix of tones so that I can get the mysterious depth to my painting. And every time I add another layer to the waves, I am making sure that the previous layer is completely dry. Here I am really focusing on the shape of the waves to give them definition and separation from each other. Here in this shot, you can really see that I am using a more rich blue tone, and I'm adding a more grayish blue underneath. And I'm focusing that saturation down towards the bottom, so when you look at my piece, your eyes are drawn to the bottom and they wander up into the fading mist. This actually took a lot of time, and I really wanted you guys to see just how careful I'm being with each layer that I lay down. Here I kind of wanted to show you guys an overall look at the waves and how I'm keeping them separate as I move along. And after that layer has dried, I created a wash of vibrant blue, and it fades up into a gray for the horizon and sky. I really wanted it to feel as if you were in the middle of the ocean, lost in an endless fog, not knowing where you're really going. And while it was still wet, I added in some darker accents so they would blend into the defined waves. Then after that, I started defining some smaller waves in the distance, using a pale gray blue so it looked more detailed, but also not, since it was fading in the distance. And if you notice, I'm still using that varied mountain shape for every single wave. Now I am taking my size 2 round brush and I'm adding in the foreground of the misty waves. I wanted to keep it loose because the waves have some reflections within them, so I decided to use a couple of different techniques with my brushing. I decided to use a more fluid technique like right there as you're seeing, but I also added in a dry brushing technique so I can get varied reflections in my waves. Once I've finished the foreground, it's time to add reflections. Now, when I added these, I did it very sparingly because I wanted the foreground to be the focal point. I did not actually add reflections all the way to the back of the waves. And as always, I added a bit of bluish gold to the foreground to bring some contrast to the endless layers of blue. Almost like a beacon of hope that someone will come find you. This was definitely the scariest part, which was removing the tape, because I really didn't want to ruin my masterpiece. But this is how it came out. My very first ocean watercolor painting. I hope you guys enjoy, and if you want to learn more about watercolor painting, you can check out my playlist here, and I will see you guys over there.